Hey lovelies, welcome back to Glam, Guilt and Cold Cases, where I do my makeup and we talk about a crime that's been keeping people up at night for decades. Today's case is one of the most unsolved famous murders in America, and that is the story of Elizabeth Short, but you might know her as the Black Dahlia. Quick disclaimer, as always, everything in this video is pulled from publicly available reports such as books, interviews and documentaries, and in today's video viewers' discretion is advised. So if this isn't for you, that's okay, and I'll catch you in the next one. So Elizabeth Short was born on the 29th of July 1924, and she was the third child to Cleo and Phoebe Short. They had 5 daughters in total. Now when Elizabeth was growing up, the family did move around a lot. They moved to Portland, Maine, before they settled in Massachusetts, which was where Elizabeth grew up. So when Elizabeth was growing up, her dad actually was making a lot of money for the family. He built miniature golf courses, think like Crazy Golf in this day and age, until the Great Depression hit. And once the Great Depression hit, obviously we all know what happened. And unfortunately for Cleo, his miniature golf business did go bust. In the 1930s, this is when it gets dark. Cleo's car is found abandoned at Charleston Bridge, and everyone is now under the impression that he has jumped in and taken his own life. This then leaves Phoebe as a widow, raising her 5 children all alone in the Great Depression, and she then gets a job as a bookkeeper. Except Cleo didn't take his own life. He'd abandoned his car and he did a runner and left his family rather than admitting that he had no money and his business had gone broke. We only know this because he wrote a letter to Phoebe years later basically saying, "I'm still alive, I want to see you and I want to see my children." And Phoebe said, "Absolutely bloody not." And I'm not actually surprised. Can you blame her? So growing up, Elizabeth was actually quite a poorly child. She suffered really badly with her lungs. She had respiratory problems and asthma, and doctors actually advised that in the colder months she spend time somewhere warmer. So she was in between Massachusetts and Florida, where other family members live. So this meant that she didn't really get much of an education. She picked up some waitressing jobs here and there when she was to and fro, but she didn't get the education like her sisters did. So in the end, Elizabeth actually ended up dropping out. But when Elizabeth was stuck indoors, she started to read in magazines, and this is where her love for movies and Hollywood started. But her obsession with Hollywood and film stars is what's going to matter in this story, because this is what essentially gets her killed. So Elizabeth is a teenager splitting her life in between cold Massachusetts and sunny Florida, and this is when she discovers her father, the man she thought died because he jumped off a bridge, is actually alive, and he is living in California, Vallejo, which is not too far from San Francisco. So at the age of 19, Elizabeth actually decides, "Hey, Dad, how are you?" And she reaches out to him, and she basically asks if she can come and live with him. Elizabeth sees this as her way out. She's like, "This is my way to the movies. This is my way to Hollywood." And her dad, of course, is like, "Yeah, do you know what? Come live with me." So he sends her $200, which I think in this currency is about $2,000, but please correct me on that if that is wrong, so she can get a train out to him. His conditions were, though, "You can come and live with me, you don't have to pay any money, but I want you to cook and clean." Sounds a bit Cinderella-like. She's like, "Yeah, absolutely, that's exactly what I will do." So she takes 2 suitcases full of all her stuff and gets on a train to California. But unfortunately, this doesn't last for long. When Elizabeth gets to her father's house, she ends up not actually keeping her end of the bargain and causing more trouble than it's worth. She's out staying late all the time because she's never cooking and cleaning for Cleo. And Cleo, well, let's just say he isn't happy about this. He was described to people as quick-tempered and very fond of a drink. So in the end, Cleo goes, "Look, Elizabeth, this isn't working," and off you go. And he sends his 19-year-old daughter out into the wild with no money, nowhere to live, and he's like, "You are not my problem anymore." And I think that just tells us what kind of father Cleo is. So Elizabeth is 19 and all alone in California, and this is where she goes and gets a job at a military camp base called Camp Cook, which today is called Vanderbilt Space Force Base. Try saying that 3 times quickly. And she really enjoyed it there. She stayed there for around 9 months, and she actually got voted the camp cutie. So this next part I didn't actually find loads of information about. However, at the end of 1944, Elizabeth is back in the East Coast for a while, and she is at a New Year's Eve party on Miami Beach, and this is where she meets Army Air Force pilot Matthew Gordon. Now these two fall for each other thick and fast. However, Matthew gets deployed overseas to China, Burma, India theatre, and this is where he is actually recovering from injuries he sustained in a plane crash, and this is where he asks Elizabeth to marry him, and obviously Elizabeth says yes. But unfortunately for them, this is where their love story comes to an end, because on the 10th of August 1945, days before the Second World War ends, Matthew is killed in a second plane crash. Now from this, as you can imagine, Elizabeth is devastated, and it says in some sources that Elizabeth is never the same again after this. So it is now 1946 and Elizabeth heads back to California, this time to Long Beach, and she is hoping to reconnect with an old boyfriend who was also military, and his name was Flickling. But unfortunately for Elizabeth, this doesn't actually pan out. I mean, it's quite sad, isn't it? Like, I couldn't even imagine going through that situation. Like, you've just got engaged, your fiance is now coming back to you, the World War has basically ended, and now you're left all alone. It's actually a very sad story. So at this point, Elizabeth is currently just drifting. She is staying with acquaintances in hotels and motels, and she just doesn't have much stability. So around this time, Elizabeth meets a woman named Dorothy French, and Dorothy French works at a movie theatre. She is a cashier, and when she's closing one night, she finds Elizabeth trying to sleep there after the final showing, and she says to Elizabeth, look, come and live with me. You know, you can't be trying to sleep here if you've got nowhere to go. Come and stay with me and my family until you get yourself back on your feet. And Elizabeth agrees, and she goes and stays with Dorothy. Now, I think it said that she stays with Dorothy for around 2 months while she's trying to get back on her feet. And then around, I think it's either a month or 2 months later, Elizabeth says to Dorothy one evening, thank you so much for your hospitality. Thank you for letting me stay. But I am now on my way, and a man of the name of Robert Manley is coming to pick her up, but everyone knows him as Red because of his hair. But unfortunately, this is the last time Dorothy ever sees Elizabeth alive. So let's talk about Robert Manley, also known as Red, whichever you prefer to know him by, because he becomes one of the main suspects in this case, because he is actually the last person to ever see Elizabeth alive. So Red is a 25-year-old travelling salesman who had a wife named Harriet, who was actually pregnant at the time, and this is a good thing to remember because Elizabeth, she didn't know any of this. So Red and Elizabeth had actually been seeing each other for quite a while, and like I said, Elizabeth had no idea that Red was married, let alone that his married wife was carrying his unborn child. They had met each other on San Francisco when Elizabeth was stood on a street corner and Red offered her a ride. In early January 1947, Elizabeth is staying in San Francisco, and this is where she gets in contact with Red, and she's like, hey, can you come and pick me up and drive me down to Los Angeles? And Red's like, yeah, of course I can. Obviously, why would he say no? So on the 8th of January, Red drives to Dorothy's house and he picks up Elizabeth, and they drive down the coast together to Los Angeles. They stop at a motel overnight and then arrive in Los Angeles on the morning of January the 9th. So Elizabeth checks her luggage into a bus depot, and Red's like, look, I don't want to leave you here, let me drive you somewhere else. So he drives her to the Biltmore Hotel in downtown LA. So Elizabeth tells Red, look, you don't have to wait with me, it's fine. I'm meeting my sister Virginia, which obviously wasn't the case because Virginia was hundreds of miles away back up in Oakland. So Red actually decides to wait in the lobby with Elizabeth, and he stays there till about 6:30 p.m, and this is when he finally decides to leave. And this was actually mentioned in his testimony in the coroner's inquest. This is actually the last confirmed sighting of Elizabeth Short alive, making phone calls in the lobby around sometime of the evening of January the 9th, 1947. And then nothing for 6 days. Nobody sees her, nobody hears from her, and then the morning of the 15th of January 1947, everything changes. Around 10 a.m. on the 15th of January, a woman named Betty Bursing is walking through Lamont Park of Los Angeles, and she is pushing her 3-year-old daughter in a pram. They are heading to go to the shoe repair shop, and then something on the sidewalk, or as we would call it, the path, like they have, you know, like it's a path and then it's like the greenery area. I'm not sure what we actually call that, but she referred to it as the sidewalk. Something catches her eye. So at first, she generally thinks it's a mannequin because it is stark white, and she thinks that it's just something that someone's discarded, and she's like, oh, people littering, that sort of thing. So she gets a little bit closer and she has a look, and that's when she realises it is in fact not a mannequin, and it is a body. So when Betty actually gets closer and she takes a closer look, this is when she realises it is a woman's body, and the woman's body has been completely severed in half, and the top half of her body is over here and the bottom half of her body is over here, and they're positioned about 10 inches away from each other. Betty grabs her 3-year-old daughter and she runs to the nearest house, and she is banging on the door and she says, please let me use your phone to call the police, because obviously they didn't have mobile phones in those days. Within the hour, the street was completely swarmed with patrol cars, detectives, and even reporters, because at this time reporters were actually listening in to police calls and they were actually getting to the scene before the police were. And unfortunately, this is actually what happened here, and this is how this case ends up being a media circus. When the police investigate the scene, what they find is horrific, even by homicide standards. The body had been completely drained of blood and there was no blood at the scene, which told detectives that she was killed elsewhere. She was then cleaned and then brought to the scene. In fact, one of the detectives later testified and said that she looked like that she had been washed before she was brought to the scene. That was how clean she was. So this next part goes into detail of how the body was found at the scene, so if you don't want to listen to this bit, you can skip ahead. Her body had been surgically bisected at the waist. She had cuts at either side of her mouth going up towards her ears to give her a permanent grin. This was known as a Glasgow smile, or is also known as a Joker smile. There were shallow cuts on her thighs in the shape of a tic-tac-toe grid. There were rope marks around her wrist, ankles and neck, which give the suggestion that she was bound, and her hair was also cut off and stuffed in her pubic region. Now, the thing that gets me the most about all of this is the tic-tac-toe, because when was the last time you played tic-tac-toe by yourself? You haven't. Well, I've never played tic-tac-toe by myself anyway. So to me, it's like, why was there tic-tac-toe carved in her? Was this two people? And then they're like, oh, let's just sit here on this body and let's play a game of tic-tac-toe. Do you know what I mean? It just doesn't sit right with me, this whole tic-tac-toe thing. It's just like, it's also a weird thing to put on someone's body. Investigators also found signs of lividity, which is blood pooling, and they noticed this that she was in a semi-reclined position when this happened. So lividity, if you don't know, is something that happens after death, and it's where the blood sinks to the lowest part of the body and then it ends up staining the skin. So this actually told investigators that she had likely been left somewhere in a seated or propped up position for hours after she died before her body was moved to the lot that she was found in. So the autopsy surgeon, Frederick Newbar, had actually determined that the woman had only been dead 24 hours from when she was found. The cause of death was officially recorded as hemorrhaging and shock from the lacerations on her face, along with concussion to the brain. The precision of the bisection immediately makes investigators think that whoever did this has some sort of surgical or anatomical knowledge, which becomes a huge thread when they begin to investigate. Fingerprints are sent via early fax technology to the FBI, and later the next evening on January 16th, 1947, the body of the woman is identified as 22-year-old Elizabeth Short. A reporter from the LA Examiner actually calls Elizabeth's mum Phoebe. But he doesn't tell her the truth right away. He calls Elizabeth's mum, pretending that Elizabeth has actually won a beauty contest, and he basically tries to get information about Elizabeth's life from her mum, and then turns around and tells her the truth and actually says, and this isn't the reason I'm calling, the reason I'm calling is to let you know that your daughter has been murdered. The paper then actually fly Phoebe to where Elizabeth is, and they do this because they want to keep the story exclusively to them, so they keep her hidden from all other press. When Phoebe arrives at the morgue and she sees Elizabeth, she is in utter distress, and she just keeps repeating about how much Elizabeth is a good girl. Meanwhile, detectives track down Cleo, Elizabeth's father, and they actually find out that he is living not too far away from where Elizabeth's body was found. They turn up at his house, and when they find him, he is extremely drunk and there is wine bottles everywhere. So they decide, we'll come back tomorrow. When they come back the next day to let Cleo know that unfortunately Elizabeth has been murdered, he is basically like still really bitter that Elizabeth didn't keep up her end of the bargain, didn't help him cook and clean in the house, and he's basically like, no, I'm through with that. I'm through with that. I'm through with her, the family, like I don't want any part of it. So he didn't go to identify his daughter's body, and he also didn't attend her funeral. It was in Long Beach, where Elizabeth had been spending some time, that the nickname started to circulate. It was believed that the nickname the Black Dahlia was given to her because of her love of dark clothes, dyeing her hair dark colours, and it was a nod to the film The Blue Dahlia that had been released a couple of years before. But the police ran with it, and the nickname the Black Dahlia stuck. So obviously the first person the police go after is Robert Manley, because he is the last known person to see Elizabeth alive. So in this time, when investigators are frantically looking for Robert Manley, they actually discover that Robert Manley had left his own car in his friend's garage, and his friend is called Palmer, and he's actually taken his friend Palmer's car to travel up to San Francisco for work. So, on the night of January 19th, 2 LAPD sergeants are now stalking out Palmer's house because they're waiting for Robert Manley to bring the car back. While they are waiting, Robert Manley obviously brings the car back to Palmer's house, and as he arrived, these 2 sergeants jump out with guns, and Robert Manley holds up his hands and he says, "I know why you're here, but I didn't do it." Robert Manley was actually questioned for 12 hours with no lawyer, and he took 2 polygraph tests, which I believe he offered to take to prove that his innocence, and obviously they came back negative. I think it's negative, isn't it, to say like he didn't do it. Basically it said he wasn't lying. The police searched him, they searched his car, they searched his house for anything of Elizabeth, and they found nothing, and they also found no blood, which was the main thing they were looking for, because if you remember, at the scene of the crime there was no blood. The investigation then became massive, and over 150 men were interviewed. And by the end of 1948, over 200 men had been formally interviewed as part of the investigation. So Mark Hansen did come under suspicion with the police because a friend of Elizabeth's had gone to the police and said Elizabeth had turned down Mark's romantic advances, and Mark was the type of guy who would go after women who were down in their luck, but it turned out that they had no evidence tied to Mark at all. But a suspect that stuck in the public's imagination for years was a doctor called George Hodel. So the reason that George was actually a suspect is because George was a physician, and that lined up with Elizabeth obviously being surgically bisected. Now, the LAPD and the DA's office did actually bug George's house, and they listened to him and his conversations and what was going in his house for weeks, and they actually heard him on one of the tapes say something along the lines of, supposedly I did kill the Black Dahlia, they can't prove that I did it. And if that doesn't give it away, I don't bloody know what does. Another detective listening in actually hears a pipe striking something, a woman then screaming, something then being hit again, and then complete silence, which is then followed by the sound of digging. However, this is actually not linked to Elizabeth, it is linked to something else. But still, it's like, come on, does this not give you enough, like, this George guy, yeah, do you know what I mean? So I have to mention this because this is genuinely horrifying, but George's 14-year-old daughter in 1949 actually accused George of sexually assaulting her, and she became pregnant. George's daughter actually testified that he attempted an abortion on her but failed, and it wasn't until a second doctor came in and managed to perform that abortion. George actually stood trial for incest, however, with even having 2 witnesses testify, George was acquitted. The reason the Black Dahlia exploded into public consciousness again years later was actually because of George's own son, Steve Hodel. Steve Hodel ironically became an LAPD homicide detective, and he was convinced after his father had died that his father was in fact the killer. So Steve actually wrote a book laying out his father's case, and he wasn't just accusing him of Elizabeth's murder. He accused his father of a string of murders, and he called these the Lone Woman murders. The theory was that Hodel travelled for work, which did line up, and that he was involved in a pattern of killings, and that Elizabeth was his final and his most infamous murder. Unfortunately, Hodel was never charged. He left the country very soon after the surveillance, travelling overseas, and he didn't actually return to the US until very later on, and he died without facing trial. It is worth being upfront though that people do still dispute this. Even though Steve Hodel's case against his own father is compelling, people are just saying it is just theories, and this is something that he needed to do because of the trauma that his father had caused him. Over the next following years, over 60 people either walked into the police station or called detectives and actually confessed to the murder of Elizabeth Short. So a restaurant porter called Daniel Voorhees actually confessed to the murder of Elizabeth Short, saying that they were having an affair. Unfortunately, though, his timeline didn't add up, because when he said the affair started, Elizabeth was still a teenager. And a woman named Minnie Suppuladeva, I've definitely pronounced that wrong, she called the police from a bar and said that she'd actually stabbed Elizabeth. But obviously that also wasn't true. None of the 60 confessions ever led to a conviction, and to this day nobody has been charged with the murder of Elizabeth Short. Elizabeth Short's murder has never been solved, closing in on 80 years, and it still remains one of the most infamous cold cases in America. What I think gets lost in all of this is the actual woman, not the Black Dahlia. Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old girl who just wanted to chase her dreams of becoming a movie star, and she never got to actually find out if that was going to happen for her. So that is the story of Elizabeth Short, also known as the Black Dahlia. Please let me know your theories down in the comments below on who you thought did it. Do you think that it was Robert Manley? Did George Hodel have anything to do with it? Is it someone I've not even mentioned? Please let me know in the comments section below. And as always, I will see you in the next one.